Welcome back to Her True Stories, where real women share their most powerful moments of truth. I'm your narrator, and today's story comes from Clara, a 59-year-old woman who discovered that sometimes the deepest betrayals come from those we love most. This is her story of love, manipulation, and the cold precision of calculated justice. Before we begin, if these stories resonate with you, if they make you feel less alone in your struggles, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. My name is Clara Wentworth, and at 59, I've learned that elegance is not just about appearances, it's about control. Standing in my Manhattan townhouse, watching the afternoon light filter through crystal chandeliers onto Persian rugs that have graced these floors for 3 generations, I understand power in ways most people never will. My late husband Richard left me well-positioned in life. Beyond the obvious wealth, the real estate portfolio, the art collection, the discreet investment firm I now run, he taught me something far more valuable: how to read people, how to see past their carefully constructed facades to the hunger beneath. That particular skill would prove invaluable on the day my daughter Melissa brought him home. "Mother, I'd like you to meet Trent," she said that crisp October afternoon, her voice carrying an unfamiliar breathlessness. At 32, Melissa had always been discerning about men, perhaps too much so. Richard used to worry she'd end up alone, married to her career in environmental law. Looking at her now, radiant and nervous in a way I hadn't seen since she was 16, I wondered if we should have worried about the opposite. Trent Morrison stepped into my foyer like he owned it. 6'2", salt and pepper hair styled just so, wearing a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, his eyes the sort of blue that photographed well. Everything about him screamed expensive, from his Patek Philippe watch to his Italian leather shoes. "Mrs. Wentworth," he said, and his voice had that particular quality of men who've learned to command rooms. "Melissa's told me so much about you. This home is extraordinary." I smiled, the expression I'd perfected over decades of charity galas and business negotiations. "Thank you, Trent. Please call me Clara. Any friend of Melissa's is welcome here." But as I led them through to the sitting room, I watched him. The way his eyes catalogued the Monet above the fireplace, the Baccarat crystal, the first edition books in their glass cases. He wasn't appreciating, he was appraising. There's a difference, subtle but crucial. Appreciation comes from the heart. Appraisal comes from calculation. "How did you two meet?" I asked, settling into my usual chair as Consuela brought tea on the good china. Melissa beamed. "At Marcus's wedding in the Hamptons. Trent was there with the Blackstone Group. He's in luxury imports. Primarily European automobiles," Trent added, accepting his teacup with a sort of casual grace that suggested he was comfortable with fine things. "Ferrari, Lamborghini, Bentley. There's quite a market for exclusivity in this city." "I imagine so," I said. "And where are you from originally?" "Here and there," he said with a laugh that was meant to be charming. "My father was in diplomatic service, so we moved around quite a bit. Dubai, Geneva, Monaco." You learn to appreciate the finer things when you're exposed to them young. The first red flag. Vague answers about family background usually meant there was something to hide. But Melissa was looking at him like he'd just quoted Shakespeare, so I simply nodded and poured more tea. Over the next hour, I learned that Trent had connections throughout Europe and the Middle East, that he was between major deals at the moment, and that he'd been taking some time to focus on personal relationships before meeting Melissa. Each answer was smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of specifics. After they left, Melissa kissing my cheek and promising to call soon, Trent shaking my hand again while his eyes did one final sweep of the room, I stood at my window watching them drive away in his black Maserati. Everything about the afternoon had been perfect. Too perfect. I called my assistant, Margaret, who'd worked with Richard and me for 15 years. "I need you to run a discreet background check," I said. "Trent Morrison claims to be in luxury car imports. Mid-40s, says his father was a diplomat." "Of course, Mrs. Wentworth. Should I use the usual investigator?" "Yes, and Margaret? Rush order. I want to know everything within a week." That evening, I stood in Richard's study, surrounded by his books and awards, his picture watching me from the mahogany desk. "What do you think, darling?" I asked his photograph. "Am I being an overprotective mother, or is my instinct right about this one?" The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Melissa called, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Mother, I have news. Trent proposed." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but my voice remained steady. "Congratulations, sweetheart. How wonderful. When did this happen?" "Last night at Daniel. He had them clear the entire restaurant, Mother." "The entire restaurant? And the ring?" "Oh, the ring is magnificent. A 5-carat emerald-cut diamond from Tiffany. I've never seen anything so beautiful. 5 carats from Tiffany. That was easily $100,000, probably more, for a man who was between deals." "When are you thinking of having the wedding?" I asked. "Soon, actually. We don't see any point in waiting. We're thinking Christmas Eve, just something small and elegant. Maybe at the Plaza?" "The Plaza. Another 100,000 minimum." I closed my eyes and counted to 3. "That sounds lovely, darling. Have you set a date to bring Trent by again? I'd love to get to know him better." "Actually, we were hoping to come for dinner this Sunday. There's something we wanted to discuss with you." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk, understanding with perfect clarity that my daughter was about to be destroyed by a man who saw her not as a person to love, but as a resource to exploit. The preliminary background check had already arrived that morning, and it painted a picture of Trent Morrison that made my blood run cold. 3 previous marriages, all to wealthy women. 2 bankruptcies. A trail of unpaid debts and angry creditors across 3 states. The diplomatic father was a fiction. Trent had grown up in suburban Cleveland, son of a used car salesman who died when Trent was 19. But the most damning detail was the timeline. Each of his previous marriages had followed the same pattern: whirlwind romance, expensive engagement, quick wedding, and then a systematic draining of his wife's assets before an acrimonious divorce. He was a professional, and Melissa was about to become his next mark. I walked through my home that night, looking at everything through his eyes. The art, the antiques, the jewelry, the real estate holdings that Melissa would inherit someday. In Trent's calculations, marrying my daughter wasn't just about accessing her trust fund. It was about positioning himself for the ultimate prize. Standing in my bedroom, brushing my silver hair, and looking at myself in the antique mirror, I made a decision. If Trent Morrison thought he could waltz into my family and systematically destroy everything Richard and I had built, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he could be. I'd spent 35 years in the world of high-stakes finance. I'd negotiated with corporate sharks, outmaneuvered hostile takeovers, and built a reputation for being both brilliant and utterly ruthless when necessary. Trent might be a skilled predator, but he was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong prey. The game was about to begin, and I intended to win. Sunday dinner at the Wentworth house had always been a tradition. Richard and I had hosted them for years, elegant affairs with perfectly prepared meals and stimulating conversation. Now, watching Melissa and Trent at my dining room table, the crystal and silver gleaming between us, I felt like I was hosting my daughter's execution. "This lamb is extraordinary, Clara," Trent said, cutting his meat with the precision of someone who'd learned proper etiquette somewhere along the way. "Rosemary and garlic?" "Rosemary, garlic, and a touch of anchovy paste," I replied. It was Richard's favorite preparation. Melissa reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I still miss him too, Mother. He would have loved to meet you, Trent, I said, the lie smooth on my tongue. Richard would have seen through this man in 10 minutes and shown him the door in 15. I wish I could have known him, Trent replied. Melissa speaks of him so fondly. A remarkable man, building what he did from nothing. Not quite nothing, I corrected gently. But yes, Richard was extraordinary at seeing opportunities others missed. I met Trent's eyes across the table. He taught me to do the same. After Consuela cleared the main course and brought coffee, Melissa's nervous energy became impossible to ignore. She kept touching her engagement ring, glancing at Trent, starting to speak and then stopping herself. What did you want to discuss? I asked finally, settling back in my chair with my coffee. They exchanged a look, and then Melissa took a deep breath. Mother, we've been presented with an incredible opportunity. Trent has connections with a luxury car dealership consortium in Miami, and they're looking for an exclusive partner to handle their New York operations. I sipped my coffee and waited. Trent leaned forward, his enthusiasm seeming genuine. It's the chance of a lifetime, Clara. Exclusive rights to represent Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, all the top-tier brands for the entire tri-state area. The initial investment is substantial, but the returns are guaranteed. How substantial? I asked. 500,000, Melissa said quickly. I know it sounds like a lot, but Trent's projections show we'll make that back in the first year, and after that, it's pure profit. I set down my coffee cup carefully. And where were you planning to get $500,000? I've already arranged it, Melissa said, her voice proud and naive. Chase approved me for a business loan. With my credit rating and the trust fund as collateral, it was quite straightforward. The trust fund. Richard's trust fund, set up to provide Melissa with income for life, but designed so the principal couldn't be touched until she turned 40. Except in cases of extraordinary investment opportunities, approved by the trustee. Melissa had somehow convinced them that Trent's car dealership scheme qualified. When did you apply for this loan? I asked. Last week. The money should be available by Friday. I looked at Trent, who was watching me with the intensity of a poker player waiting to see if his bluff would work. This dealership consortium, what's their name? Prestige Motors International, he said without hesitation. Based in Miami Beach, with partnerships throughout Europe and the Middle East. And you've worked with them before? Extensively. I've handled their Geneva operations for 3 years. Lies. All of it lies. The full background report had arrived that morning, and there was no Prestige Motors International, no Geneva operations, no luxury car consortium. There was only Trent Morrison, professional grifter, spinning a fantasy for my daughter's benefit. It sounds very exciting, I said. Congratulations on securing the loan. Melissa's face lit up with relief. Oh, Mother, I'm so glad you approve. I was worried you might think it was too risky. Business always involves risk, darling. The key is making sure you understand what those risks are. After they left, I sat in Richard's study and opened the complete background report. Trent's real history was even worse than I'd imagined. The car dealership scam was his signature move. He'd used variations of it to bilk his previous wives out of nearly $2 million combined. But this time would be different. This time, he'd chosen the wrong family. I picked up my phone and dialed James Crawford, my personal attorney and one of Richard's oldest friends. Clara, he said warmly, how are you holding up? I need a favor, James. A very discreet one. 3 days later, I sat in my office overlooking Central Park, reviewing the documents James had prepared. Through a series of shell corporations and legal maneuvers that would have made Richard proud, I now had options. Melissa's loan would go through. I couldn't stop it without revealing my knowledge of Trent's deception, which would only make her defend him more fiercely. But I could position myself to act when the inevitable collapse came. The call came on Thursday. Melissa, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Mother, can you come over? Please? Something terrible has happened. I found her in the penthouse apartment she and Trent had moved into the week before, a glass tower on the Upper East Side with Central Park views and a monthly rent that exceeded most people's annual salaries. She was curled on their white leather sofa, still in her work clothes, mascara streaked down her cheeks. Sweetheart, what's wrong? I sat beside her and pulled her into my arms, just as I had when she was small. The money, she whispered. It's gone, Mother. All of it. What do you mean, gone? Trent said there were unexpected fees. Import licenses, regulatory approvals, deposits for the first inventory shipment. He had to move quickly, or we'd lose the opportunity. How much is left? Nothing. It's all invested in the business now. I held her while she cried, my own fury burning cold and steady. $500,000, gone in less than a week. Spent on God knew what. Trent's gambling debts, probably, or payments to previous creditors, or simply blown on the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to maintaining. Where is Trent now? I asked. Miami. Meeting with the consortium about the next phase. Miami. Where there was no consortium, no business, no future except the one I was going to create for him. Melissa, I said carefully, have you seen any documentation about this business? Contracts, partnership agreements, anything official? She pulled back, her eyes red but defensive. Of course. Trent handles all the business side, but he's shown me everything. The contracts are very complex, international law, import regulations. I wouldn't understand them anyway. I might, I said gently. I've been dealing with international business contracts for 30 years. Would you feel better if I took a look? Relief flooded her face. Would you, Mother? That would be wonderful. I know you'll see what an incredible opportunity this is. That night, I reviewed the documents Trent had shown Melissa. They were impressive forgeries, official letterheads, complex legal language, even fake signatures from fictional executives. Someone had spent considerable time and money creating them, but they were still forgeries. And now I had proof. I made a decision then, sitting in my study with the fake contracts spread across Richard's desk. I could show Melissa the truth, try to make her see what Trent really was. She'd be hurt, embarrassed, but she'd survive. She might even thank me eventually. But that would be mercy. And mercy, I was beginning to understand, was not what the situation called for. Trent Morrison had chosen to prey on my daughter. He'd calculated that her love would make her vulnerable, that her trust would make her easy to exploit. He'd looked at my family and seen weakness to be leveraged. He was about to learn how catastrophically wrong that assessment had been. I opened my laptop and began to research. By morning, I knew everything about every debt Trent Morrison owed, every creditor he'd stiffed, every bridge he'd burned. I knew about the angry investors in Cleveland, the furious ex-wife in Chicago, the collection agencies that had been hunting him for 2 years. And I had a plan. 2 weeks after the loan money disappeared into Trent's fictional business empire, they came to me. Not with triumph or good news, but with desperation so palpable it changed the very air in my sitting room. Melissa sat on the edge of my antique settee, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Gone was the radiant bride-to-be I'd seen a month earlier. In her place was a hollow-eyed woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Trent stood by the window, his usual commanding presence reduced to nervous pacing. "Mother," Melissa began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need help." I set down my teacup with deliberate care. "What kind of help, sweetheart?" "Financial help," Trent said, turning from the window. "Temporary, of course. Just until our cash flow stabilizes." "I thought the business was thriving," I said. Melissa told me the initial phase was proceeding beautifully. They exchanged a look, the kind of communication that passes between two people who've been rehearsing a conversation. Melissa took a shaky breath. There have been some complications. The regulatory approval process is taking longer than expected, and we've had to advance more capital for inventory deposits. Our accounts are temporarily frozen while the international transfers clear. Every word was Trent's coaching, delivered in Melissa's voice. I could practically see the script he'd given her. How much do you need? I asked. 200,000, Trent said quickly. Just for 60 days, 90 at the outside. Once the approvals come through and we can start moving inventory, we'll pay you back with interest. I stood and walked to my own window, looking out at the garden Richard had loved. Behind me, I could feel their desperation like heat from a fire. That's a substantial amount, I said. I know, Mother, I know it is, Melissa said, and now there were tears in her voice. But if we don't bridge this gap, we'll lose everything. The consortium has other options. If we can't meet our obligations, they'll move on to the next candidate. I turned back to face them. Trent was watching me with the intensity of a man betting everything on a single hand. Melissa looked like she might shatter. Let me think about it, I said. Clara, Trent said, stepping forward, I understand your caution, but time is crucial here. The consortium needs an answer by Friday. Then you'll have one by Friday, I replied, my voice carrying just enough steel to make him take a step back. After they left, I stood in my foyer watching their retreat through the security camera. In the car, I could see them arguing, Melissa gesturing frantically while Trent gripped the steering wheel. I walked back to Richard's study and opened the file that now occupied the center of his desk. 3 weeks of investigation had revealed the true scope of Trent Morrison's debts. He owed nearly $400,000 to various creditors, with interest and penalties pushing the total higher every day. The Maserati was leased and 3 months behind. The penthouse apartment was in Melissa's name, but the deposit had come from a cash advance on one of his credit cards. He was drowning, and he was using my daughter as a life preserver. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb, a private investigator who'd helped Richard and me with delicate matters over the years. Marcus, I need you to trace where the loan money actually went. I can do that, but it'll take some time. These guys usually move money through multiple accounts to obscure the trail. I have time. I also need you to identify all his creditors. Every single person and entity he owes money to. That's a longer list. Are you planning some kind of intervention? I smiled, though Marcus couldn't see it. Something like that. The research took another week. When Marcus delivered his final report, the picture was even uglier than I'd imagined. The $500,000 had been gone within 48 hours. $200,000 had gone to pay off his most pressing debts, creditors who'd been threatening legal action. Another $100,000 had disappeared into offshore accounts that Marcus couldn't trace, but suspected were connected to gambling debts. The remaining $200,000 had been spent on maintaining his lifestyle, luxury hotels, expensive dinners, a new Rolex, cash withdrawals that suggested he was paying people off. Not one penny had gone toward any legitimate business expense. Armed with this information, I made my next move. Through one of my investment firm's subsidiary companies, I quietly approached Trent's 3 largest creditors. The offer was simple. I would buy their debt at face value, taking over collection efforts in exchange for complete ownership of what Trent owed. All 3 accepted immediately. Debt collection was expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of recovery. A cash buyout was like Christmas morning. By Friday, I owned nearly $200,000 of Trent Morrison's debt. Legally, he now owed me money instead of them, and I had access to all their documentation of his fraud and deception. When Friday arrived, Melissa called at exactly 9 a.m. "Mother, have you made a decision?" "Yes, sweetheart. I have. The relief in her voice was heartbreaking. Oh, thank God. I knew you wouldn't let us down. Come for lunch, I said. Both of you. We'll discuss the terms then. They arrived precisely at noon, their desperation now masked behind forced optimism. Trent wore his most expensive suit and his most confident smile. Melissa had clearly spent extra time on her makeup, trying to hide the stress that was aging her before my eyes. Over Caesar salad and poached salmon, I let them make their pitch again. Trent painted pictures of the fortune they'd make once the business was operational. Melissa spoke about their future, their plans to start a family, their dreams of building something lasting together. I listened to every word, my expression attentive and motherly. It sounds wonderful, I said when they finished. Truly. And I've decided to help you. Melissa actually cried with relief. Trent's smile was so broad it looked painful. However, I continued, given the size of the loan and the complexity of your business arrangements, I'll need some additional documentation. Partnership agreements, proof of the regulatory applications, bank statements showing the frozen accounts. Standard due diligence. Trent's smile flickered for just a moment. Of course. Though some of the documents are proprietary. Trade secrets, you understand. I understand business, Trent. I've been doing this for 30 years. My lawyers will need to review everything before I can release funds of this magnitude. How long will that take? Melissa asked. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. These international business arrangements can be quite complex to analyze. I watched Trent's face cycle through a dozen calculations. 2 weeks meant 2 weeks of creditor pressure, 2 weeks of mounting interest, 2 weeks of the house of cards getting shakier. But he had no choice. He needed my money more than he needed to maintain his fiction. Of course, he said finally. I'll have everything couriered to your office Monday morning. After they left, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, watching the sun set behind the city's skyline. By now, Trent would be frantically calling his forger, ordering new fake documents to support his non-existent business. He'd spend what little money he had left trying to make his lies look convincing enough to fool me. What he didn't understand was that I already knew every detail of his deception. The documentation he was scrambling to create would only provide more evidence for what was coming next. I raised my glass to Richard's memory. Phase 1 complete, darling. Now comes the interesting part. The forged documents arrived on Monday in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. Trent's attention to detail was almost admirable. Whoever he was paying to create these fantasies was a genuine artist. Partnership agreements with embossed seals, bank statements on official letterhead, even regulatory filings that looked authentic enough to fool a casual observer. But I wasn't a casual observer. I was Clara Wentworth, and I had been dissecting complex financial documents since before Trent Morrison learned to tie his shoes. I spent Tuesday morning with James Crawford, my attorney, reviewing every page. It's impressive work, James admitted, adjusting his reading glasses. Expensive, too. These didn't come from some back-alley operation. No, I agreed. He's investing heavily in maintaining his fiction. Clara, I have to ask, why are we letting this continue? You have enough evidence to expose him right now. Melissa would be hurt, but she'd recover. I set down the fake regulatory filing I'd been examining and looked at my old friend. James had been Richard's roommate at Yale, best man at our wedding, godfather to Melissa. He'd earned the right to question my judgment. Because exposing him now would be mercy, I said. And mercy is what got us into this situation. Melissa is brilliant, James, but she's also trusting to a fault. She sees the good in people, even when it's not there. If I simply show her these documents are fake, she'll blame herself for being fooled. She'll carry that shame forever. And if you don't, I smiled, and James actually leaned back in his chair. If I don't, then Trent Morrison will learn that there are consequences for preying on the people I love. Real consequences. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Patricia Chong, who ran the most exclusive private investigation firm in the city. The kind of firm that CEOs used when they needed to know if their business partners were cheating on their wives, or if their wives were cheating on them. Patricia, I need comprehensive surveillance on someone. 24 hours a day, for the foreseeable future. Of course, Clara. What are we looking for? Everything. Where he goes, who he sees, what he buys, who he talks to. I want to know what he has for breakfast. The second call was to Michael Santos, a man Richard had occasionally used for matters that required absolute discretion. Michael specialized in acquiring things, information, objects, access, that weren't technically for sale. Michael, I need you to find out about offshore accounts. Someone's been moving money through channels they think are invisible. How invisible are we talking? Caribbean banks, shell corporations, cryptocurrency exchanges. Professional-grade money laundering. That's expensive work, Mrs. Wentworth.
I'm aware.
Send me your fee structure. The third call was to Elena Rostova, a woman who operated in the gray spaces between legitimate business and the kind of enterprise that never appeared on tax returns. Richard had known Elena since his early days in international finance, before he became entirely respectable. Elena, I need to purchase some debts. Privately. What kind of debts? The kind that desperate men accumulate when they're trying to live like kings on borrowed time. Elena's laugh was like silk over steel.
Ah, Clara.
It has been too long since we talked. Send me the details. By the end of the week, I owned 60% of Trent Morrison's outstanding debts. Every unpaid credit card, every personal loan, every IOU he'd signed in the past 2 years, I was now the legal creditor. Through a network of shell corporations and holding companies that would have impressed the Swiss, I had effectively become Trent's primary financial problem. And he had no idea. The surveillance reports made for fascinating reading. Trent's days followed a predictable pattern. Expensive lunches with people who looked increasingly skeptical of his promises, visits to high-end jewelry stores where he examined pieces far beyond his means, long phone calls from his car where his body language suggested he was either begging or threatening. But the most interesting discovery came from Patricia's surveillance team on Thursday evening. He's been visiting a storage unit in Queens, she reported during our weekly briefing. Goes there every few days, usually after dark. Stays for about an hour. What's in it? We managed to get some long-range photos when he had the door open. Luxury goods, mostly. Watches, jewelry, art objects, wine. Looks like he's been stockpiling assets. Stolen. Unknown. Could be legitimate purchases he's hiding from creditors, could be items he's planning defense, could be things he's taken from previous victims. I studied the photographs Patricia had provided. Even from a distance, I could identify several pieces that looked suspiciously familiar. A Patek Philippe watch that might have been identical to one Richard had admired at auction. A small bronze sculpture that looked remarkably similar to one from my own collection. I want that storage unit monitored around the clock, I said. And I want to know everything about the rental agreement. By Monday, I had the answers. The storage unit was rented under the name of one of Trent's shell corporations. The monthly fees were paid by automatic transfer from an account that traced back to his second wife's divorce settlement. And the insurance policy on the contents listed a value of over $2 million. Trent Morrison wasn't just a con artist, he was a collector. Every successful scam, every destroyed life he'd left behind, had generated trophies that he kept like hunting prizes. That night, I stood in my study looking at the wall where Richard's portrait hung beside photographs of our life together. Our wedding day, Melissa's graduation from law school, charity galas where we danced until midnight. A life built on love and trust and mutual respect. Trent had looked at that life and seen something to be exploited, destroyed, consumed. He'd calculated that my daughter's heart would be his pathway to my fortune. He's not wrong about the fortune part, darling, I said to Richard's photograph. He's just wrong about who's going to end up with it. I opened my laptop and began composing an email to Elena Rostova. By the time I finished, the sun was rising, and I had outlined a plan that would have impressed Machiavelli. Trent Morrison thought he was playing chess, while everyone else played checkers. He was about to discover that some people play games he'd never heard of. Games where the rules were written by the winner, and mercy was a luxury reserved for those who deserved it. The charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum was one of those crystalline New York evenings where Manhattan's elite gathered to see and be seen while ostensibly supporting a worthy cause. The Costume Institute benefit had always been one of Richard's favorite events, not for the glamour, but for the business opportunities that arose when powerful people drank expensive champagne and felt magnanimous. I wore black Valentino and my grandmother's diamonds, the combination striking enough to remind everyone present that Clara Wentworth was a force to be reckoned with. More importantly, I knew Melissa and Trent would be there. They'd bought tickets they couldn't afford because Trent understood the importance of maintaining appearances. I found them near the Egyptian wing, Trent resplendent in a tuxedo that fit too perfectly to be rented, and Melissa radiant in a silver gown that caught the museum's dramatic lighting. They were talking to Amanda Richardson, whose late husband had made billions in tech stocks. Clara. Amanda embraced me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had several glasses of champagne. You look absolutely stunning. How are you holding up, darling? Well enough, I replied, accepting her air kisses. Though I do miss having Richard here to explain why the auction estimates are completely wrong. We chatted for a few minutes about the evening's featured pieces, and I watched Trent's eyes light up when Amanda mentioned she was considering selling her late husband's wine collection. Actually, she said, I could use some advice on that. David collected for 40 years, but I wouldn't know where to begin with the valuation. You should talk to Trent, Melissa said proudly. He has extensive experience with luxury goods and international markets. I watched Trent's face transform into his most persuasive expression. Wine collections require very specialized handling, he said. The authentication process alone can be incredibly complex. I'd be happy to take a look and give you a preliminary assessment. Would you? That would be wonderful. They exchanged contact information, and I filed away the interaction for future reference. Trent was already working on his next mark before he'd finished destroying his current one. Later in the evening, I found myself standing with Trent near the Temple of Dender while Melissa was in the ladies' room. The moment I'd been waiting for. It's remarkable, isn't it? I said, gesturing toward the ancient Egyptian temple. All that power and wealth reduced to a museum exhibit. Trent smiled, comfortable with what he perceived as philosophical small talk. The pharaohs probably thought their dynasties would last forever. But they understood something important about legacy, I continued. They knew that true wealth isn't about what you accumulate, it's about what survives you. Very true. Though I imagine they also enjoyed their wealth while they had it. I turned to face him directly. Trent, can I ask you something? Off the record, as family? His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Of course. This business venture of yours, the car dealership consortium, how confident are you really? I mean, truly confident, not just the optimistic projections you've shown Melissa. For just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw calculation behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of whether honesty or continued deception would serve him better. The business is solid, Clara, he said finally. But you're right to be cautious. Any investment of this magnitude carries risk. That's why I've been so grateful for your support through the due diligence process. Of course. Though I have to admit, some of my contacts in international trade have raised questions about regulatory compliance in luxury imports. The penalties for mistakes can be severe. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. What kind of questions? Oh, nothing specific. Just general concerns about documentation, provenance verification, that sort of thing. I'm sure your consortium has excellent legal counsel. The best, he said quickly. Everything is completely above board. Melissa returned then, slipping her arm through Trent's and smiling at us both. What are you two talking about so seriously? Just business, I said. Trent was telling me about the regulatory complexities of international luxury trade. It sounds so complicated, Melissa said. I'm grateful I married someone who understands all of that. I watched Trent's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. It's what I do, he said. The seed was planted. Over the next few days, I had Elena's associates spread carefully crafted rumors through the networks where such information traveled. Word began circulating that federal investigators were taking a closer look at luxury import operations, particularly those with Middle Eastern connections. Nothing specific, nothing traceable back to me, just the kind of industry gossip that made people nervous. Meanwhile, Patricia's surveillance team reported that Trent was making increasingly frantic phone calls. His visits to the storage unit in Queens became more frequent, and he'd begun moving some of the smaller, more valuable items. He's liquidating assets, Patricia reported during our Tuesday briefing. Probably trying to raise cash quickly. Any idea where the money's going? Several directions. Some to immediate creditors who've been pressing hardest. Some into offshore accounts we're still trying to trace. And some, interestingly, to a high-stakes poker game that runs out of a private club in Midtown. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. Trent wasn't just a con artist, he was also a gambling addict. That explained the rapid disappearance of money, the constant need for new schemes, the desperate energy that surrounded him. I want to know everything about that poker game, I said. Who runs it, who plays in it, what kind of money changes hands. Already on it. Should have details by Friday. That evening, Melissa called, her voice tight with stress. Mother, could I come over? I need to talk to someone. I found her in my sitting room an hour later, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since she was a child. What's wrong, sweetheart? It's Trent. He's been so different lately. Distracted, anxious. He gets these phone calls that he takes in another room, and when I ask about them, he says it's just business stress. The regulatory issues are probably weighing on him, I said carefully. What regulatory issues? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The ones he mentioned at the gala. The complications with the import licensing. Melissa stared at me. He didn't mention any complications to me. What exactly did he say? I had to make a choice in that moment. I could protect Melissa's feelings by deflecting, or I could begin the process of opening her eyes to the truth. Perhaps I misunderstood, I said. But he seemed concerned about federal oversight of international luxury trade. I got the impression there might be some additional documentation required. He hasn't said anything about that to me. In fact, he's been telling me everything is moving forward perfectly. I watched my daughter's face as the implications sank in. If Trent was keeping regulatory concerns from her, what else might he be hiding? I'm sure it's nothing serious, I said. But perhaps you should ask him directly. After Melissa left, I sat in Richard's study and opened the latest surveillance report. According to Patricia's team, Trent had lost nearly $50,000 at the poker game over the past 2 weeks. Money that should have been going toward the debts he owed, debts that I now owned. I picked up my phone and called Elena. It's time to apply some pressure, I said. What kind of pressure? The kind that makes desperate men make stupid mistakes. Within 48 hours, Trent began receiving calls from collection agencies representing his various creditors, agencies that were actually working for me, though he had no way of knowing that. The calls were polite but persistent, requesting payment schedules and updated financial information. The surveillance reports showed the immediate impact. Trent's stress levels spiked dramatically. He made 6 trips to the storage unit in 2 days, removing items and presumably converting them to cash. His phone calls became more agitated, his body language more desperate. And then, exactly as I'd hoped, he made his first major mistake. On Friday evening, he took Melissa to dinner at Le Bernardin, a restaurant that costs more for one meal than most people spent on groceries in a month. Patricia's team photographed them through the window, Melissa looking beautiful and trusting while Trent's eyes constantly scanned the room like a man expecting trouble. But the interesting part came after dinner. Instead of going home, Trent dropped Melissa at their apartment and drove to Queens, to the storage unit. This time, he removed a small painting that Patricia's team identified as a likely Picasso sketch. Within 2 hours, he was at the private club where the poker game ran. By Sunday morning, he'd lost the Picasso and everything else he'd brought to the table. I spent Sunday afternoon in my garden, tending to the roses Richard had planted in our early years of marriage. Each bloom was perfect, the result of careful nurturing and patient attention. As I worked, I thought about the difference between cultivation and exploitation. Trent Morrison had looked at my daughter and seen something to exploit, her trust, her love, her resources. He'd calculated that her emotions would make her vulnerable to manipulation. But he'd made a fundamental error in his assessment. Melissa wasn't just a wealthy woman he could seduce and abandon. She was my daughter, and that made her destruction a personal affront that required a personal response. I finished with the roses and went inside to call Melissa. "Sweetheart, how was your weekend?" "Strange, actually. Trent's been gone a lot. Business meetings, he says, but... Mother, can I ask you something?"
Anything.
"When you were reviewing the business documents, did you notice anything unusual? Anything that didn't seem quite right?" The moment had arrived sooner than I'd expected. My daughter's instincts were finally overriding her heart. "What kind of unusual?" I asked carefully. "I don't know. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but some of the details Trent has told me don't seem to match what I see in the paperwork. Small things, but they add up." I finished.
Yes.
They add up. I closed my eyes and made the decision that would change everything. "Melissa, I think you should come over. There are some things we need to discuss." The financial earthquake began on a Tuesday morning in March, with the kind of systematic precision that comes from months of careful planning. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when the first domino fell, though Trent wouldn't know it for several hours. At exactly 9:30 a.m., 3 different collection agencies, all secretly working for me, simultaneously filed legal actions against Trent Morrison for defaulted debts totaling $347,000. The lawsuits were carefully timed to hit the public records system during peak business hours, ensuring maximum visibility among the financial and legal communities where reputation was everything. At 10:15 a.m., Patricia called with surveillance updates. "He's at the storage unit again," she reported. "3rd time this week. Looks like he's removing more items." "What kind of items?" "Hard to tell from our vantage point, but they're small enough to fit in briefcases. Jewelry, probably, or small art pieces." By noon, Trent's world was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. The poker game losses had depleted what little liquid capital he had left, and the sudden legal pressure from multiple creditors meant he could no longer juggle payments to keep the most aggressive ones at bay. The call I'd been waiting for came at 2:47 p.m. "Mother?" Melissa's voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "Could you come over? Please? Something's happening, and I don't understand what." I found them in their penthouse apartment, the space that had once seemed like a symbol of their bright future, now feeling like a beautiful cage. Melissa sat curled in the corner of their white leather sofa, still wearing her work clothes but looking like she hadn't slept in days. Trent paced by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a mixture of pleading and barely controlled panic. No, you don't understand, he was saying. This is a temporary cash flow issue. The business is about to close a major deal. Yes, I understand the legal implications, but… He caught sight of me and abruptly ended the call. Clara, thank you for coming. What's happening? I asked, settling beside Melissa and taking her cold hand in mine. There's been some kind of mistake, Trent said, his usual smooth confidence replaced by manic energy. Several creditors have filed spurious lawsuits claiming I owe them money. It's obviously a coordinated attack, probably from competitors trying to sabotage the business deal. What kind of money are we talking about? Nothing substantial. Some old credit card debts, a few personal loans from years ago. Things I thought were settled. I looked at the papers scattered across their coffee table, legal documents, collection notices, bank statements. Even from across the room, I could see the red numbers that indicated accounts in crisis. How much total? I asked. Melissa spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. They're saying $347,000, Mother, plus penalties and interest. That's impossible, Trent said quickly. The actual amounts are a fraction of that. These collection agencies inflate numbers to intimidate people into settling. I picked up one of the legal notices and read it carefully. It was from Bradley and Associates, a collection firm that Elena's people had recommended. Their documentation was impeccable, every debt meticulously traced and verified, every legal requirement satisfied. Have you contacted your attorney? I asked. That's the problem, Melissa said, her voice breaking slightly. Our attorney isn't returning calls. And our accountant says his firm can't represent us anymore due to a conflict of interest. Rats abandoning a sinking ship, Trent muttered. The minute there's any pressure, these people disappear. I studied his face as he spoke. Even in crisis, he was still performing, still trying to control the narrative. But I could see the cracks in his facade, the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes couldn't quite meet mine, the sheen of perspiration despite the apartment's air conditioning. Perhaps I could recommend someone, I said. James Crawford is excellent with complex financial matters. Would you? Melissa asked, hope flickering in her eyes. That would be wonderful. Of course. Though James will need complete financial disclosure. Bank records, investment accounts, business documentation. Everything. The color drained from Trent's face. That might be problematic. Some of the business accounts are structured for confidentiality. International banking regulations, you understand. I'm sure James can handle whatever discretion is required, I said smoothly. He's been dealing with complex international finance for 30 years. That evening, I received a call from James Crawford. Clara, I've reviewed the situation, and it's worse than you indicated. The collection actions are just the beginning. If this man has been operating any kind of business with falsified documentation, we're looking at potential federal charges. What kind of charges? Wire fraud, securities fraud, mail fraud. The federal prosecutors love these financial crime cases. They're career makers. And if someone were to provide additional evidence of fraudulent activity, then Mr. Morrison would be looking at significant prison time. I hung up and walked to my window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Trent was probably liquidating more stolen assets, trying to buy himself time he didn't have. Somewhere else, Melissa was lying awake wondering how her perfect life had become a nightmare so quickly. The next morning brought new developments. Patricia's surveillance team reported that Trent had made 3 trips to different pawn shops, carrying briefcases that he left significantly lighter than when he'd arrived. He'd also visited 2 different banks, presumably trying to secure emergency loans that no legitimate institution would approve given his deteriorating credit situation. More importantly, he'd made a critical mistake. He's been using Melissa's credit, Patricia reported during our Wednesday briefing. Applied for a business line of credit using her social security number and listing her as the primary applicant. Without her knowledge? Almost certainly. The application was submitted online from his computer while she was at work. Identity theft. Another federal crime to add to the growing list. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. That afternoon, Melissa called, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "Mother, they've frozen our accounts. All of them. Even my personal checking account." "Who's frozen them?" "The bank. They say there's evidence of fraudulent activity, and they're required to hold all assets pending investigation." I knew exactly what had triggered the freeze. Elena's people had provided certain financial institutions with anonymous tips about suspicious transactions connected to Trent's various accounts. Banks took fraud allegations very seriously, especially when they involved large sums of money and international transfers. "Where are you now?" I asked. "At home." He's not handling this well, Mother. He's talking about leaving the country, finding somewhere we can start over. Fleeing the jurisdiction. The final confirmation that Trent Morrison knew exactly how guilty he was. "Sweetheart, you need to listen to me very carefully. Do not leave the country with him. Do not sign any documents he gives you. And do not let him convince you that running is the solution." "But, Mother, what if he's right? What if this is all some kind of mistake or conspiracy? Maybe if we just get away from here, we can figure out what's really happening." I closed my eyes and thought about my daughter at 5 years old, trusting me to protect her from monsters under the bed. The monsters were real now, but she was still looking to me for protection. "Melissa, I want you to pack a bag and come stay here tonight. Just for tonight, while we sort this out. I can't leave Trent. Not when he needs me most." "Then bring him too." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Trent would never willingly put himself in a position where I could observe him closely, especially not now when his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "He won't come," she said finally. "Then that should tell you something important about where his priorities really are." That night, I sat in Richard's study with a glass of wine and the latest surveillance reports. Trent had spent the evening at his storage unit, this time removing what appeared to be the last of the valuable items. Based on the size and shape of the objects Patricia's team had photographed, he was down to his final assets. The endgame was approaching faster than even I had anticipated. Within days, maybe hours, the financial and legal pressure would reach a point where Trent would have to make a choice, face the consequences of his actions or run. I knew which choice he would make. Men like Trent Morrison always ran when cornered. It was their nature. But this time, he wouldn't get far. The restaurant was Le Bernardin, the same place where Trent had taken Melissa for their expensive farewell dinner just days before. I'd chosen it deliberately, not for the irony, though that was satisfying, but because it was the kind of public venue where dramatic scenes created lasting impressions. It was Thursday evening, and I was dining with Caroline Ashworth and her husband David, old friends who moved in the same social circles as everyone who mattered in Manhattan. The kind of people whose presence guaranteed that whatever happened tonight would be discussed at every charity gala and private club for months to come. "Clara, you look radiant," Caroline said as we settled at our table. "How are you holding up with all the stress about Melissa?" Word traveled fast in our world. The legal actions against Trent had already become gossip fodder among the Upper East Side social set. "It's been challenging," I admitted, "but I have faith that truth has a way of revealing itself." Across the restaurant, I spotted them. Melissa and Trent, seated at a corner table, their body language telling the story of a relationship under extreme pressure. Melissa sat rigidly upright, her hands clasped in her lap, while Trent leaned across the table speaking in urgent, animated whispers. "Is that Melissa over there?" David asked, following my gaze.
"Yes."
"She and Trent are having dinner. I believe they're discussing their options." What Caroline and David couldn't see, but what I knew was coming, was the team of federal agents positioned at strategic points around the restaurant. Patricia's contacts in law enforcement had been invaluable in coordinating the timing. The investigation into Trent's fraudulent business schemes had accelerated rapidly once the FBI received anonymous tips about forged documents and suspicious international transfers. When they traced the money from Melissa's loan and discovered it had been funneled through multiple shell corporations into offshore gambling accounts, the case had become a priority. I watched Melissa's face as Trent spoke, saw the exact moment when his words registered, and her composure began to crack. Even from across the restaurant, I could see her shaking her head, pulling back from the table. Then the agents moved. They approached with the professional efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. 3 men in dark suits, federal badges visible, moving through the restaurant like sharks through water. Trent Morrison? The lead agent's voice carried clearly in the suddenly quiet dining room. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The only sound was the soft jazz playing from the restaurant speakers and the clink of silverware as someone set down their fork. Trent looked up, and for just a moment, I saw him calculate whether he could run. But there was nowhere to go. The agents had positioned themselves to cut off every exit. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." The words echoed in the hush that had fallen over the restaurant. I watched Melissa's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as the handcuffs clicked around Trent's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Caroline gripped my arm. "Oh my God, Clara. That's Melissa's husband." "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." As the agents led Trent away, I saw him scan the restaurant one final time. His eyes found mine across the room, and for just a moment, we looked directly at each other. In his expression, I saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, when he realized that his careful manipulation had been matched by an even more careful counter-manipulation. He knew. He knew who had orchestrated his downfall. Melissa sat frozen at their table, her face white with shock, as the other diners tried to pretend they weren't staring. The agents had left one detective behind to speak with her, standard procedure when arresting someone's spouse. I excused myself from my table and walked across the restaurant. "Melissa?" She looked up at me with eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older than her 32 years. "Mother?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't understand what's happening." The detective introduced himself and explained that Melissa wasn't under arrest, but would need to answer some questions about her husband's business activities. As he spoke, I watched my daughter's face as the reality of her situation began to sink in. "The business," she said slowly. "The car dealership consortium. It wasn't real, was it?" "No, ma'am," the detective said gently. "We believe your husband was operating what's known as an advance fee fraud scheme. The consortium, the international partnerships, the regulatory approvals, all of it was fabricated." Melissa looked at me with something that might have been accusation. "You knew, didn't you? That's why you wanted to review the documentation. You knew it was fake." I sat down beside her and took her cold hand in mine. I suspected. The background didn't check out, and some of the details were inconsistent. But I needed to be certain before I said anything. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks." "A few weeks." Her voice rose slightly, causing nearby diners to look our way again. "You've known for weeks that my husband was a criminal and you didn't tell me?" The detective cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if we could continue this conversation at the station?" "Of course," I said. "Melissa, I'll call James Crawford to meet us there." As we left the restaurant, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes following us. By tomorrow morning, the story would be all over the society pages. Melissa Morrison, daughter of the late Richard Wentworth, married to a federal fraud suspect. The kind of scandal that destroyed social standing and professional reputations. which was exactly what I'd intended. At the police station, the detective's questions were thorough but not unkind. Melissa answered with growing devastation as the scope of Trent's deception became clear. The loan money hadn't just been stolen, it had been part of a pattern stretching back years, involving multiple victims and millions of dollars. The storage unit in Queens, the detective said, consulting his notes. Were you aware that your husband was keeping assets there? What storage unit? We executed a search warrant this afternoon. Recovered approximately $1.2 million worth of luxury goods. Watches, jewelry, art objects, wine. Some of the items appear to match descriptions from previous victims. Melissa closed her eyes. Previous victims. Your husband has been running variations of this scam for at least 5 years. You appear to be the largest single target, but not the only one. After we left the station, I drove Melissa back to my house in silence. She sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, looking like someone emerging from a terrible dream. How long will he go to prison? She asked as I pulled into my driveway. Years, I said. Federal fraud charges carry significant sentences, especially with his criminal history. Criminal history? I looked at my daughter. Brilliant, accomplished, but still naive enough to believe that love could overcome any obstacle. Melissa, Trent Morrison has been arrested twice before for similar schemes. He served 18 months in federal prison in 2018. Everything about his background, the diplomatic father, the Geneva business connections, even his name, was designed to make him seem like someone you could trust. She was quiet for a long time after that, sitting in my sitting room with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. I loved him, she said finally. I know you did. How could I have been so stupid? You weren't stupid. You were trusting. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now it feels like the same thing. I sat beside her on the sofa, where she told me about her engagement just months before, when her future had seemed so bright and full of promise. Melissa, what happened to you could have happened to anyone. Trent is a professional. Deceiving people is what he does for a living. You're not the first intelligent woman to fall for his act, and unfortunately, you probably won't be the last. But you saw through him immediately. I had advantages you didn't. I wasn't in love with him, and I've spent decades learning to spot financial predators. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. What happens now? Now you rebuild. You're young, you're brilliant, you have a career you love. This will pass. And the money? The money is gone, sweetheart. The government will try to recover what they can, but most of it has probably been moved through channels where it can't be traced. What I didn't tell her was that I already knew exactly where the money had gone, and that recovering it would be easier than she imagined. But that revelation would come later, when she was ready to hear it. For now, it was enough that Trent Morrison was in federal custody, his carefully constructed empire of lies finally collapsed, his freedom measured in the single-digit years he would spend behind bars. The first phase of justice was complete. The morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of March wind that cuts through even the finest wool coats. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the city wake up, and thought about timing. In my experience, the most devastating blows were delivered not in anger, but with the precise calculation of a surgeon's scalpel. Today was surgery day. Melissa had been staying with me for 2 weeks since Trent's arrest, sleeping in her childhood bedroom and moving through my house like a ghost. She'd taken leave from her law firm. The scandal had made her position there untenable, at least temporarily, and spent her days in my garden or sitting in the library, reading novels that let her escape into other people's problems. I'd given her space to grieve. The loss of a marriage, even a fraudulent one, required mourning. But today, reality would assert itself in ways that sympathy couldn't soften. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Melissa was in the breakfast room, picking at toast and reading the Times, still in her robe and pajamas. She looked up when Consuela announced that there were gentlemen to see Mrs. Melissa. Gentlemen. She looked confused. I'm not expecting anyone. I set down my coffee cup. I believe they're here about the penthouse. Understanding flickered across her face, followed quickly by dread. The foreclosure? I nodded. I'm afraid so. The men in my foyer wore the professional demeanor of people accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. 2 lawyers from the bank's legal department, a property manager, and a moving coordinator. They had papers that needed to be signed, deadlines that had to be met, procedures that couldn't be avoided. Mrs. Morrison, the lead attorney said, "We understand this is a difficult time, but the court has issued a final judgment of foreclosure. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Melissa accepted the documents with hands that trembled slightly. 48 hours? But I thought we'd have more time. Trent said the bankruptcy filing would delay everything. Your husband's bankruptcy petition was denied due to evidence of fraudulent transfers and hidden assets. The court determined that the filing was made in bad faith. I watched my daughter's face as she processed this information. Even in custody, Trent had been trying to manipulate the system, filing legal motions designed to delay consequences rather than face them honestly. "What about my personal belongings?" she asked. "You're permitted to remove personal effects, furniture, and any items that weren't purchased with the fraudulent loan proceeds. However, anything that could be considered proceeds of criminal activity will be held pending the resolution of your husband's criminal case." After they left, Melissa sat in my sitting room holding the foreclosure papers like they might burst into flames. "I need to go pack," she said finally. "I'll come with you." "No, Mother. This is something I need to do alone." But I insisted, and an hour later we stood in the penthouse that had been her home for only a few months. The space looked different now, smaller somehow, less glamorous. The floor-to-ceiling windows that had once framed views of Central Park now felt like barriers between Melissa and a world that no longer made sense. We worked in silence, sorting through the remnants of her brief marriage. Clothes and books went into suitcases. Wedding gifts were examined for provenance. Anything expensive enough to have been purchased with stolen money would be confiscated eventually. "This is surreal," Melissa said, holding up a crystal vase that had been a wedding gift from the Richardsons. 6 months ago, I thought I was the luckiest woman in New York. Now I'm homeless and married to a federal criminal." "You're not homeless," I said firmly. "You have a place with me for as long as you need it." "That's not the point, Mother. The point is that my entire life was built on lies. Everything I thought I knew about my husband, about our future, about myself, all of it was fake." I sat on the edge of their former bed, and watched my daughter fold clothes that represented a version of herself that no longer existed. "Melissa, can I tell you something your father once said to me?" She looked up from the suitcase she was packing. "He said that the measure of a person isn't what happens to them, but how they respond to what happens to them. You've been dealt a terrible hand, sweetheart. But how you play it from here, that's entirely up to you." She was quiet for a long time after that, moving through the apartment with methodical efficiency. In the closet, she found a stack of documents Trent had hidden behind his suits, more fake business contracts, bank statements for accounts that probably didn't exist, correspondence with fictional business partners. "Should I turn these over to the FBI?" she asked.
Yes.
"They'll want everything." In his nightstand drawer, she discovered something that made her sink onto the bed with a gasp. A small leather journal, filled with handwritten notes in Trent's precise script. "What is it?" I asked. She handed me the journal, her face pale. "Read the entry from February 14th. Valentine's Day." I flipped to the page and read. "C continues to resist direct investment approach. Melissa's emotional attachment to Mother creates opportunity, but also complication. May need to accelerate timeline if loan money depletes faster than projected. Alternative scenario, Convince M to pressure C for additional funds by creating crisis situation. Gambling losses can be portrayed as business setbacks. Important to maintain appearance of devoted husband while positioning for maximum extraction. I read the entry twice, feeling cold rage settle in my chest. Even his love for my daughter had been calculated, strategized, reduced to tactical considerations in a criminal enterprise. There are more, Melissa said quietly. Pages and pages of notes about me, about you, about our family's finances. He was studying us, Mother, like we were some kind of business problem to be solved. I flipped through more pages, reading Trent's analysis of our family dynamics, his assessment of my wealth and potential vulnerabilities, his step-by-step plan for gaining access to my assets through manipulation of Melissa's emotions. The final entry was dated 3 days before his arrest. Situation deteriorating rapidly. Legal pressure from creditors increasing. M beginning to ask questions about business documentation. May need to implement exit strategies sooner than planned. Offshore accounts accessible from Dubai. M will be collateral damage, but unavoidable. Collateral damage. That's how he saw my daughter. Not as a person he claimed to love, but as acceptable casualties in his pursuit of wealth. I want to burn it, Melissa said, her voice hollow. I want to burn every trace of him and pretend this never happened. I understand that impulse, I said. But this journal is evidence. It proves premeditation, shows the scope of his planning. The prosecutors will want it. We finished packing in somber silence. As we prepared to leave, Melissa took one last look around the apartment that had briefly been her home. I keep thinking I should feel sadder, she said. But mostly I just feel angry. Anger is good, I replied. Anger means you're done being a victim. That evening, we sat in my study while Melissa called the FBI to arrange turning over Trent's journal. As she spoke to the detective, I opened my laptop and began reviewing documents that had been prepared weeks earlier. Through my shell corporations, I now own not just Trent's debts, but the debt on the penthouse apartment as well. The foreclosure that had just forced Melissa from her home had been orchestrated by me, executed through legal channels that would never be traced back to the Wentworth family. Tomorrow, I would own the apartment outright. Along with the storage unit in Queens, Trent's remaining financial assets, and anything else of value he'd accumulated during his criminal career. But none of that was for my benefit. It was all part of a larger plan, one that would soon reveal itself to my daughter in ways she couldn't yet imagine. For now, it was enough that Trent Morrison had lost everything: his freedom, his assets, his carefully constructed identity, and most importantly, his ability to hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt Melissa. The second phase of justice was complete. Spring arrived late that year, finally breaking through winter's grip in the first week of April. I was in my garden, pruning roses that had survived the harsh cold, when James Crawford called with news that would close one chapter of the story and open another. Clara, the plea bargain is finalized. Morrison is taking 12 years in federal prison. I set down my pruning shears and sat on the garden bench Richard had built 20 years earlier. 12 years. The prosecutors were prepared to seek 25 if it went to trial. But with his cooperation in recovering assets and identifying other victims, they agreed to the reduced sentence. What kind of cooperation? Bank account information, details about the money laundering operation, names of associates who helped him forge documents. Apparently, your daughter's journal evidence was particularly valuable in establishing the conspiracy charges. Through the study window, I could see Melissa at Richard's desk, working on job applications. She'd decided to leave her old firm permanently, too many awkward questions and pitying looks, and was exploring opportunities with nonprofit organizations. The scandal had damaged her professionally, but it had also clarified her priorities in ways that might ultimately prove beneficial. There's something else, James continued. The asset forfeiture hearing is scheduled for next week. They've recovered approximately 1.8 million in cash and assets from Morrison's various accounts and the storage unit. The court will determine how much can be returned to victims. And Melissa? She'll likely recover about 60% of what she lost, maybe more. The government's gotten very good at clawing back stolen funds, especially when they have cooperation from the perpetrator. After we hung up, I remained in the garden, thinking about justice and its various forms. The legal system would provide one kind of justice. Trent would lose 12 years of his life, and some money would be returned to his victims. But there were other kinds of justice, more personal and perhaps more lasting. I walked back into the house and found Melissa exactly where I'd left her, surrounded by legal documents and laptop computers, rebuilding her life one application at a time. Any promising leads? I asked. The Environmental Defense Fund wants to interview me next week. It would be a significant pay cut from the firm, but the work would be more meaningful. Your father always said that meaningful work was its own form of wealth. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. I remember him saying that. Usually when I complained about my trust fund being smaller than my friends. Speaking of which, I need to discuss something with you. About your financial situation. Her expression grew wary. Mother, I've told you, I don't want any loans or gifts. I need to rebuild this on my own. This isn't about charity, sweetheart. It's about something that belongs to you. I handed her a folder I'd been carrying. These are documents related to the asset recovery from Trent's criminal enterprise. She opened it reluctantly, scanning the legal papers with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years reading contracts. I don't understand. This shows that someone purchased Trent's debts from his original creditors. Multiple purchases, through different companies. Keep reading. Her eyes widened as she worked through the corporate structure diagrams James had prepared. Shell companies within shell companies, all ultimately tracing back to a single source. Wentworth Holdings, she said slowly. Mother, that's your company. One of them, yes. You bought Trent's debts? All of them? I sat across from her, watching understanding dawn on her face. Over the course of several months, yes. I became his largest creditor, without his knowledge. But why? If you knew he was a fraud, why not just expose him immediately? I chose my words carefully, because exposing him would have meant proving to you that your judgment was wrong, that your trust had been misplaced. You would have blamed yourself for being fooled. This way, the evidence of his criminality came from external sources. The FBI, the courts, his own actions. So you manipulated the situation to protect my feelings? I manipulated the situation to protect your future. She stared at the documents, her legal training helping her piece together the full scope of what I'd orchestrated. The collection agencies that filed the lawsuits, those were working for you? Yes. The financial pressure that made him liquidate assets? Yes. The anonymous tips that led to the FBI investigation? Elena Rostova has contacts in law enforcement who take financial crime very seriously. Melissa set down the papers and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I met him. I knew what he was within 10 minutes of conversation. And you let me marry him anyway. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the conversation where my daughter would either understand my choices or reject them entirely. Melissa, I could have stopped the wedding. I could have shown you the background reports, the evidence of his previous crimes, the proof that everything about him was a lie. But if I had, what would you have learned? That my mother was right, and I was wrong. Exactly. And the next charming sociopath who came along would have found you just as vulnerable because you wouldn't have learned to recognize the warning signs yourself. She was quiet for a long time, processing not just my words, but the implications of everything that had happened. So this was all educational? This was justice, sweetheart. Real justice, not just legal consequences. Trent Morrison spent years preying on women like you, intelligent, successful, trusting women who believed that love meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt. He destroyed lives and felt no remorse because he saw his victims as marks rather than human beings. I opened another folder and handed her a different set of documents. These are property deeds. The penthouse apartment, the storage unit, several other assets that Trent accumulated through his various schemes. I don't understand. When I purchased his debts, I also positioned myself to acquire the assets that would be forfeited when he inevitably collapsed. Everything he stole, everything he bought with stolen money, everything he used to maintain his lifestyle, it all reverted to his creditors. Which means it all came to me. But that's... She calculated quickly. That's millions of dollars. Approximately $2.3 million, once the final transfers are complete. Mother, you can't just take stolen property. Even if you technically own the debt, this money belongs to his victims. I smiled, feeling pride in my daughter's moral compass even as I prepared to surprise her further. You're absolutely right, which is why I'm not keeping it. I handed her a final document. A property transfer deed, already signed and notarized, transferring ownership of all Trent Morrison's forfeited assets to Melissa Morrison, formerly Melissa Wentworth. I don't want this, she said immediately. I won't profit from what he did to other people. You're not profiting from what he did to other people. You're recovering what he stole from you, and you're taking responsibility for making his other victims whole. I opened my laptop and showed her a spreadsheet I'd been working on for weeks. These are Trent's victims from his previous schemes, identified through court records, police reports, and private investigation. 12 women over 8 years, with total losses of approximately $1.9 million. You want me to pay them back? I want you to choose to pay them back. The money is yours legally and ethically, but how you use it will define who you are going forward. Melissa stared at the screen, reading names and stories of women who'd been exactly where she was now, betrayed, humiliated, financially devastated by a man they'd trusted. There's a woman in Chicago who lost her entire retirement savings, I said quietly. A widow in Florida who had to sell her home. A young mother in Texas who's still paying off debt from loans she took out to fund his business opportunities. If I do this, if I use this money to compensate his victims, what happens to me? I still lost everything I invested in his schemes. You did. And you'll rebuild, because you're strong enough and smart enough to do so. But you'll rebuild knowing that you turned a criminal's stolen wealth into justice for people who had no other recourse. That evening, we sat in Richard's study while Melissa read through every case file I'd compiled. Stories of women who'd been targeted, seduced, and systematically robbed by the man she'd married. Women who'd trusted their hearts and been punished for their faith in human decency. The woman in Chicago, she said finally. Margaret Chen. She's 73 years old. Yes. And she lost $200,000. Her late husband's life insurance payout. She thought she was investing in a restaurant franchise. She'll never be able to earn that money back.
No.
She won't. Melissa was quiet for another hour, reading and thinking. Finally, she looked up at me. If I do this, I want to do it right. Not just cutting checks, but making sure they know that someone understands what they went through, that someone cares about the damage he caused. What did you have in mind? Personal letters, explanations of how the money was recovered, acknowledgement of what they suffered, and maybe a fund for future victims. Something permanent. I felt my heart swell with pride. This was my daughter at her best, taking an impossible situation and finding a way to create meaning from it.
There's one more thing, I said.
A final decision you need to make. I handed her the last document in my collection, a victim impact statement form from the federal court system. Trent's sentencing hearing is next month. You have the right to address the court before he's sentenced. To say what? Whatever you need to say. To him, to the judge, to yourself. She held the form without opening it. What would you do? I would make sure he understood that his actions had consequences beyond just legal punishment. That he had destroyed more than just bank accounts and credit scores. That there was a human cost to his choices. And then I would walk away and never think about him again. 2 weeks later, Melissa signed the property transfer documents that made her the legal owner of Trent Morrison's forfeited assets. She also signed 12 smaller documents, letters to his previous victims, along with checks that would restore what they had lost and perhaps a little more for the years of hardship they'd endured. The final phase of justice was complete. Thank you for staying with us through Clara's incredible journey. Before we conclude, I want to remind you that if stories like this resonate with your own experiences, you're not alone. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these powerful tales of resilience and justice. Your support means everything to our community of strong women. 2 years have passed since that spring morning when I first met Trent Morrison in my foyer. As I write this, I'm sitting in the same study where Richard and I once planned our future together, but now I'm planning something different, a legacy that honors both his memory and the hard-won wisdom my daughter and I have gained. The sentencing hearing had been cathartic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Melissa chose to read her victim impact statement, and her words had been precise, powerful, and utterly devastating. She didn't scream or cry or beg for maximum punishment. Instead, she spoke about trust, about the psychology of manipulation, about the ripple effects of financial crime on families and communities. "You didn't just steal money from me," she told Trent, looking directly at him across the courtroom. "You stole my ability to trust my own judgment. You stole years of my life that I'll spend second-guessing every relationship, every business decision, every moment when someone asks me to believe in them. That's the real crime here. Not the dollars and cents, but the human cost of your choices." Trent had looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, diminished by the reality of his circumstances. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he'd mumbled something about being sorry and wanting to make amends. But his eyes, when they briefly met mine, still held that calculating emptiness that had betrayed his true nature from the beginning. 12 years in federal prison. He would be 71 when he was released, assuming he served his full sentence. Too old to run sophisticated cons, too marked by his criminal record to regain the trust of potential victims. It was enough. The months that followed had been a period of rebuilding for both of us. Melissa thrived in her new position with the Environmental Defense Fund, leading a team that investigated corporate environmental crimes. The skills she developed in corporate law translated perfectly to tracking down polluters who thought they could hide their crimes behind complex financial structures. "It's funny," she'd told me recently. "Learning to spot Trent's lies made me much better at recognizing when corporations are lying about their environmental practices. I know what deception looks like now." The victim compensation fund she'd established had grown beyond our initial projections. Word spread through law enforcement networks about the Wentworth Foundation's work with fraud victims, and we began receiving referrals from prosecutors across the country. Women who'd been scammed by romance fraudsters, elderly people bilked by investment schemes, small business owners destroyed by criminal partners. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same. Trust exploited, vulnerabilities weaponized, lives destroyed by people who saw other human beings as resources to be consumed. "We can't save everyone," Melissa had said during one of our foundation board meetings. "But we can make sure that when someone's life is destroyed by financial crime, they don't have to rebuild entirely alone." My own life had found new purpose as well. The private investment firm that Richard and I had built together was now focused exclusively on what we called ethical wealth building, helping women who'd been victims of financial manipulation learn to rebuild and protect their assets. I'd also become something of an expert witness in federal fraud cases, helping prosecutors understand the psychology of sophisticated con artists and the methods they use to identify and manipulate their targets. The key, I'd explained to a courtroom full of lawyers and law enforcement officers just last month, is understanding that these criminals don't just steal money. They study their victims. They learn their hopes, their fears, their emotional vulnerabilities. They become exactly the person their victim needs them to be. It was during that testimony that I'd looked out at the gallery and seen a familiar face, Amanda Richardson, the wealthy widow Trent had been cultivating at the Metropolitan Museum Gala 2 years earlier. She'd been subpoenaed as a witness in another fraud case, having narrowly avoided becoming a victim herself when Trent's arrest made headlines. After the hearing, she'd approached me in the hallway. "Clara, I never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For saving me from making the same mistake your daughter did." When I saw the news about Trent's arrest, I realized how close I'd come to letting him manage my late husband's wine collection. He could have stolen millions from me. I'd smiled, remembering the calculating look in Trent's eyes when he'd first heard about Amanda's wine collection. He would have, I'd agreed. That was always his plan. That evening, I'd sat in my garden with a glass of wine, a bottle from Richard's collection that Trent would never have the chance to steal, and reflected on the strange mathematics of justice. Trent Morrison had destroyed approximately $2.3 million in wealth during his criminal career. Through the forfeiture process and the foundation Melissa had established, we'd been able to recover and redistribute approximately $2.1 million to his victims. But the real victory wasn't mathematical. It was in the letters we received from women who'd used their compensation to restart their lives. The elderly widow who'd been able to avoid selling her home. The young mother who'd paid off the debt that was destroying her family. The small business owner who'd used his recovered funds to rebuild the company that a criminal partner had nearly destroyed. Each of those letters represented a life restored, a future reclaimed, a victory over the kind of evil that saw human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of wealth. This morning, I received a letter that crystallized everything we'd accomplished. It was from Margaret Chen, the 73-year-old woman in Chicago who'd lost her husband's life insurance money to one of Trent's schemes. "Dear Mrs. Wentworth and Ms. Morrison, I wanted to write to tell you that I used the money from your foundation to buy a small house near my daughter's family. For 2 years, I thought I would have to spend my remaining years as a burden on my children, living in their basement, because I could no longer afford my own place. But more than the money, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. The belief that there are still good people in the world who care about doing what's right. When that man took my savings, he didn't just steal money. He stole my faith in humanity. You gave it back to me. Thank you for showing me that justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. With gratitude, Margaret Chen." I read the letter twice, then walked to Richard's portrait and smiled at his familiar face. "We did it, darling," I said. "We turned one man's evil into something that helps heal the world." Last week, Melissa came to dinner with news that surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "I've been seeing someone," she said over the salmon Consuela had prepared just the way Richard used to like it. "Oh." I kept my voice carefully neutral. "His name is David Torres. He's a federal prosecutor who specializes in white-collar crime. We met during one of the Foundation advisory meetings. And I think you'd like him. He's honest to a fault, completely transparent about his background, his finances, his intentions. Sometimes brutally honest. It's actually kind of refreshing." "How long have you been seeing him?" 6 months. I wanted to be sure before I mentioned it to you. I studied my daughter's face. She looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way she hadn't since before she'd met Trent. But there was something else there too, a kind of confidence, a strength that came from surviving the worst kind of betrayal and emerging intact. "What makes you trust him?" I asked. "I don't," she said simply. Not completely. I may never trust anyone completely again, and I'm okay with that. But I trust my ability to recognize deception now. And I trust my ability to survive whatever happens. That's probably healthier than the alternative. What makes you trust him? I asked. I don't, she said simply. Not completely. I may never trust anyone completely again, and I'm okay with that. But I trust my ability to recognize deception now. And I trust my ability to survive whatever happens. That's probably healthier than the alternative. I think so too. And David understands that. He knows my history, knows why I need things to be transparent and verifiable. He's patient with my questions and my skepticism. That night, I thought about trust and its various forms. The blind trust Melissa had given Trent had nearly destroyed her. But the careful, informed trust she was building with David was something stronger. Trust earned through consistency, verified through actions, proven through time. Perhaps that was the most important lesson from this entire experience. Not that we should never trust, but that we should trust wisely. This morning, I received a call from Elena Rostova. Clara, I have interesting news about your former son-in-law. What kind of news? He's been making friends in federal prison. Specifically, he's been offering to help other inmates plan financial crimes for when they're released. I wasn't surprised. Men like Trent Morrison never truly changed, they just adapted to new environments. I thought you might want to know, Elena continued, in case you wanted to pass the information along to the appropriate authorities. I'll make some calls, I said. By evening, federal prosecutors had been notified that Trent Morrison was continuing to engage in criminal conspiracy, even from prison. Depending on what their investigation revealed, he might be facing additional charges that could extend his sentence significantly. Some might call that vindictive. I call it protecting his future victims. As I write these final words, I'm looking out at the garden where Richard and I used to plan our future together. The roses he planted are blooming magnificently this year, stronger and more beautiful than ever after surviving the harsh winter that tested their resilience. I think about the women who will never meet Trent Morrison, never fall for his carefully crafted lies, never lose their life savings to his schemes, because he'll be too old or too closely watched or too broken by prison to hurt anyone else. I think about the victims who've been made whole, the lives that have been restored, the faith in justice that has been renewed. And I think about my daughter, who took the worst thing that ever happened to her and transformed it into a force for good in the world. That's the real victory here. Not the punishment of one evil man, but the creation of something positive from his destruction. The understanding that justice isn't just about consequences, it's about restoration, protection, and the patient work of making the world a little safer for the people we love. Trent Morrison looked at my family and saw wealth to be stolen, trust to be exploited, love to be weaponized. But he miscalculated in the most fundamental way possible. He thought that kindness meant weakness, that trust meant naivety, that love meant vulnerability. He was wrong. In the end, our love for each other became the foundation of his destruction. Our trust in justice became the mechanism of his downfall. Our kindness toward his victims became the instrument of their restoration. He didn't just lose his freedom, his wealth, and his future. He lost the game itself, defeated by the very qualities he'd tried to exploit. And we won more than justice. We won wisdom, strength, and the deep satisfaction that comes from turning evil into good. Some might say that revenge is a dish best served cold. But I've learned something different. Justice is a dish best served with love, patience, and the absolute determination to protect the people who matter most. That concludes Clara's remarkable story of love, betrayal, and ultimate justice. If you found strength in her journey, please subscribe to her true stories and share this video with other women who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful testimonies to light. Remember, you are stronger than you know, wiser than you think, and capable of creating justice even in the darkest circumstances. Until next time, keep fighting, keep growing, and keep believing in your own power.